Boxing Day. If you aren't out shopping or recovering from Christmas dinner, perhaps you have given a thought to Stephen, the first martyr, whose feast is today. How interesting that he is offered to us immediately after our joyful celebration of Christmas. The joyful story of a birth, followed by the violent story of a death. All we know about Stephen is in the 6th chapter of Acts, the second book of Luke's Gospel. As the number of disciples continued to grow in Jerusalem, there were both Hebrew speakers and Hellenists who were Greek-speaking Jews of Hellenistic or Greek culture. The Hellenists complained that their widows were not being treated equally with the Hebrew-speaking widows, and so it was decided to choose others, Greek speakers, to help them, essentially in charitable work, and among them Stephen. As Stephen's lengthy discourse indicates, his ministry, along with that of Philip, did not turn out to be service at table, but rather preaching. Perhaps the origin of the dual ministry of the deacon in service and preaching. It is the longest speech in Acts. But soon opposition to Stephen arose from among the religious authorities. He spoke with wisdom and grace and authority, and members of the Sanhedrin saw his face was like the face of an angel. They could not tolerate that, and like Jesus, martyrdom followed. The many similarities with the birth and death of Jesus are obvious. The child put himself in the hands of authorities, as did Stephen. Both are vulnerable, take a risk, and both suffer. Like the incarnation itself, martyrdom is an act of love for which we must be free, a freedom toward which St. Ignatius guides us with God's grace in the spiritual exercises. The heavens opened for Stephen just as they had for Jesus at his baptism. And of course, Stephen's words recall those of Jesus, asking that his spirit might be received and that his persecutors be forgiven. But why, you might ask, disturb the charm of Bethlehem with this violence? In fact, we know that Jesus was born into a world of violence, much like our own world today, a world of international and increasing domestic violence. Children are born this day into the same violence, from here in Washington to Gaza to Ukraine to many villages and cities in Central America, in Africa, and beyond. Who is willing to take a risk to love them and die for them? We are steered away from the fairy tale of the birth when we consider, for instance, Doctors Without Borders and others who are doing exactly that all over the world this day, putting themselves in danger, taking a risk in love. Perhaps that is why Stephen, the first martyr, is offered to us precisely on this day, the day after Christmas. Stephen gives himself entirely, just as God gives God's self entirely in the incarnation we celebrate, and God always being born in us. So what about us as we consider the story of Stephen? Just as he called Stephen, the Lord is calling us, in freedom and in love, to serve and to witness, to be with the poor wherever we find them, and to preach that same love in the ordinariness of our daily lives. How is God asking us to live out the juxtaposition of the baby and the martyr in our own lives?